Right now, somewhere in a waterproof jacket that cost you $200, you are still getting wet. And 10,000 years ago, a man with nothing but a knife and a piece of bark stayed perfectly dry through a storm that would have shut down a modern campsite. That is not a legend. That is a fact that has been buried under centuries of consumerism, convenience, and the quiet arrogance of modern technology. Over 500 generations of indigenous knowledge so precise, so deeply connected to the living world around it, that no laboratory has ever fully replicated it, has been reduced to a footnote in history. My name is part of something older. This is Primal Echoes, where the past speaks, and the forgotten becomes useful again. Stay with me until the very end of this video, because the one secret that ties everything together, the single idea that made all of their survival possible, will not be revealed until the final minutes. Before they built a single shelter, before they cut a single strip of bark or sewed a single seam, they did something that no modern survival manual has ever taught you. They listened. Not to a forecast, not to an app. They stood at the edge of the forest, and they read it. The way you would read the face of someone you love, watching for every signal, every shift, every whisper of what was coming. And that listening was not a skill. It was a philosophy, a way of understanding that the natural world was not an obstacle to be conquered, but a conversation to be joined. That single difference in mindset is what separated people who merely survived from people who thrived for centuries across some of the harshest landscapes on Earth. And one of the first lessons in that conversation was the birch tree. Indigenous peoples never took bark from just any tree. They would never touch a young tree, a weak tree, or a tree that was not ready to give. They knew that the ideal donor was a mature birch growing in the right soil, in the right light, and that the right moment was spring, when the sap was moving and the bark was alive with natural oils, elastic and full of a wax-like compound called betulin. That single compound is a natural waterproofing agent, so chemically sophisticated that modern researchers have spent decades trying to synthesize it in laboratories, and still fall short of what a birch tree produces quietly, every single year, for free. When the bark was harvested, it was laid in overlapping layers like the scales of a fish, each piece tilted so that water had no choice but to roll downward and away. A shelter built this way could remain dry for years without a single coat of synthetic sealant. But what strikes me most deeply about this is not the chemistry. It is the ritual. The act of taking bark was never casual. It was approached with the understanding that you were asking something of a living being. The inner layers were never damaged, because the goal was not to take, but to cooperate, so that the tree could heal and give again. There is something in that idea that the modern world has quietly lost, and I think many of you feel that loss, even if you have never put it into words. Think about the last time you used something from nature, and thought about what you were asking of it. Most of us never do. And yet these peoples built their entire survival on that single act of respect. When you hear that, does it change how you think about what we call progress? Because here is what I want you to hold on to as we go deeper. The birch bark was just the beginning. What comes next is a material so unexpected, so invisible, so strange, that when I tell you what it is, you will not believe it was ever worn on a human body. Now I want you to picture the most perfectly engineered rain shelter ever designed by human hands. Not the geodesic dome, not the modern cabin with its layered insulation and vapor barriers. I am talking about a structure never taught in any architecture school, never drawn on a blueprint, never tested in a wind tunnel, and yet, by every measurable standard of physics, it outperforms nearly everything we have built since. The teepee of the Great Plains. At first glance, it looks simple, a cone of animal hide stretched over poles. But that simplicity is the result of centuries of engineering so refined that every angle, every proportion, every detail has a purpose that modern science has only recently begun to appreciate. The conical shape was not chosen for tradition. It was chosen because a cone has no flat surface for water to pool on. Every raindrop hits a slope and immediately travels downward and away. The angle was calculated, not with instruments, but with generations of observation. Steep enough that water rolled off faster than it could be absorbed through the seams. And those seams were a technology in themselves. bone needles and sinew thread, stitched so tight they were nearly airtight, each placed with an understanding of how wet hide behaves differently from dry. At the top, the smoke hole was not just a chimney, it was a pressure valve. Warm air rising from the central fire created a draft that pulled moisture away from the interior, and the smoke itself was a treatment, its particles filling the microscopic pores of the hides and polymerizing the natural fats into a water-resistant coating that rain could not penetrate. The teepee did not just shelter people from the storm, it used the storm's own energy to protect itself. But now I need to tell you about the material I promised, the one that will stop you mid-sentence if you try to describe it to someone who has never heard of it. The most waterproof material indigenous peoples ever created was not bark, it was not leather, it was something so unexpected that the first time most people hear it, they laugh, and then go quiet when they realize it outperforms what they paid $200 for at an outdoor gear store. They used the intestines of large animals, bison, elk, sea mammals along the northwest coast, carefully cleaned, split lengthwise, stretched on frames, and dried into long translucent strips, thin as paper, strong as rope, and completely impermeable to water. The Aleut peoples sewed entire kayaking suits from sea mammal intestine, so perfectly sealed that a hunter submerged in freezing ocean water emerged dry. No Gore-Tex, no factory, just a sacred understanding that every part of an animal carried value. Not just the meat, not just the hide, but every organ, every membrane. 500 years before zero waste appeared in any sustainability textbook, these peoples were already living it, not as a philosophy, but as a daily practice born from love and necessity. Does the idea of wasting nothing feel radical to you today? Because it was simply called living, once. And here is what I need you to understand. All of this knowledge becomes worthless the moment you put it in the wrong place. And the mistake I am about to describe is one that 90% of modern campers make every single time they pitch a tent. Here is the mistake. You find a flat piece of ground, you think it looks good, and you put your tent down. That is the entire decision-making process for most modern campers. And it is exactly the kind of thinking that would have gotten you soaked and miserable in a world without synthetic sleeping bags. Because indigenous peoples understood something about land that we have completely forgotten. That the ground beneath your feet has a memory. Water has traveled across every inch of it and left behind evidence of every path it has ever taken. The moss growing thick on the north side of a stone tells you where moisture lingers longest. The way grass leans after a storm tells you which direction surface water moved. The dark patches of soil, in an otherwise dry field, tell you where water pools invisibly underground. An experienced person could read a piece of ground the way a doctor reads an X-ray, seeing not what is there now, but what happens there when the sky opens up. They never chose low ground, never chose the bed of a dry creek, no matter how convenient it looked. They knew that in heavy rain, that dry creek would remember what it was. Instead, they chose gentle rises with soft slopes on all sides, where water had no reason to gather and every reason to move on. The entrance was always placed on the leeward side, so that driving rain could never find a direct path inside, with the forest itself used as a windbreak and a first layer of protection. But even perfect placement was never considered enough. Around every permanent dwelling, a shallow drainage ditch was dug in a ring around the structure, nothing more than a channel, the width of a hand, cut with a simple stick or bone tool. Water flowing toward the shelter would reach that ditch, follow the path of least resistance, and be redirected downhill and away. And here is the detail I find almost elegant. The soil from the ditch was not discarded. It was piled along the inner edge, creating a small earthen ridge. One digging action, two layers of defense simultaneously. That is the kind of thinking that comes from living close to a problem for a very long time. Now, a dry shelter means nothing if the person inside it is soaked to the skin. The most important waterproofing tool for clothing was not a material, it was a process. Rendered fat from bear, bison, or moose was purified, warmed until liquid, and worked deep into leather garments by hand, penetrating into every microscopic pore until there was no space left for water to enter. Then the garment was smoked over a low fire, the heat causing the fats to undergo natural polymerization. the same chemical process that modern wax treatments attempt to replicate, achieved here, with nothing more than fire and patience. On the northwest coast, the Tlingit and Haida took a different path entirely, weaving the inner fibers of red cedar bark into rain capes so densely that the finished garment functioned like a tiled roof, vertical fibers creating natural channels that guided water downward and away. Think about what it took to make one of those capes. Weeks of labor, hour after hour of patient, focused work. And I do not believe those women did it out of obligation. I believe they did it because the person who would wear that cape was someone they loved, and their skill was the only thing standing between that person and the cold. That is not survival. That is devotion woven into fabric. The same devotion extended down to the feet. Moccasins treated with fat and smoke gave the outer shell, but the true genius was what went inside. Dry grass or moss packed against the foot like a living insole, drawing moisture away from the skin. When it became saturated, it was removed and replaced with fresh material from the next campsite. No drying rack, no waiting. Just discard the wet, insert the dry, and keep moving. Leather gaiters sealed the gap between trouser and shoe, so that walking through wet grass could not flood the footwear from above. 3 layers of protection for the feet alone, because these people understood what modern hikers still learn the hard way, that once your feet are wet, everything else becomes harder. And none of this could function without fire. The tinder fungus, a bracket fungus growing on tree trunks, could smolder for hours without flame, like a slow-burning cigar carried at your belt, its coal preserved in a hollowed horn with just enough airflow to keep it alive. Arriving at a wet campsite with a smoldering fungus meant fire was never more than minutes away. Dead lower branches of conifers, sheltered dry by the canopy above, were the first kindling. Larger wood was placed near the growing flame to dry before it was asked to burn. When I look at all of this together, the sight reading, the drainage, the clothing, the fire, I do not see survival techniques. I see a civilization, and I think that distinction matters more today than it ever has. So before we reach the end, tell me in the comments, of everything you heard today, which one surprised you most? Because what comes next is the answer to the question I opened with. The secret that was never really about rain at all. So here it is, the secret I promised you at the very beginning of this video. And I want you to notice that it is not a technique, it is not a material, it is not a recipe, or a method, or a step-by-step process. The secret that made everything else possible. The bark roofs, the conical shelters, the invisible waterproof garments, the drainage systems, the living insoles, the smoldering fungi carried through the rain. All of it grew from a single root. They were not afraid of nature. They did not experience rain as an enemy to be defeated or a problem to be engineered away. They experienced it as a teacher, as a force that had something to tell them if they were quiet enough to listen. And because they listened, they learned. And because they learned, they built solutions so elegant, so perfectly adapted, that thousands of years later we are still trying to reverse engineer them in laboratories. We built walls to stop the rain. They learned to move with it. We declared war on the elements. They joined the conversation. And I genuinely believe, that something in that difference explains not just how they survived, but why their knowledge still echoes across time, and finds us here, today, still listening. If something in this video stopped you, if one idea shifted something in the way you see the world around you, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments, what is the one thing from today that you want to carry with you? And if these are the kinds of stories that matter to you, if the wisdom of people who lived closer to the earth than we ever have speaks to something you have been looking for, then subscribe to Primal Echoes, because what comes next will take everything we explored today and push it into a darkness that makes rain feel warm. Next time, we go north, deep north, to the world of the Viking, people who did not merely survive winters of -40 degrees, but who built a civilization inside them. The fire systems, the longhouses, the clothing technology that kept warriors alive in conditions that would kill a modern man in hours. That story is coming, and I think you are going to want to be here for it.